This is VOA Africa. Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory in for Hashtag the US. It's Thursday, August 22nd. This is Africa 54. How the U.S. slave trade fueled America's economic rise and left painful scars that remain centuries later. The African Development Bank warns that risks to growth are increasing by the day. And tech-savvy Ethiopian youth showcase inventions to address community challenges. Slavery remains a deep, dark chapter in American history. The transatlantic slave trade involved the purchase and transportation of enslaved Africans, mainly to the Americas, by Europeans. Those who survived the horrific voyage were destined for a life of servitude to their white masters. This crime against humanity that took place in the Americas lasted for more than 200 years. VOA's Chris Simpkins reports on the impact the U.S. slave trade had in transforming the fortunes of families and building a new America.
This is where it is, right?
This is the DeWolf family cemetery. This is the funeral mound of James DeWolf. It's hard to muster much sympathy for the lack of dignity in this for someone who engaged in slave trading and on that kind of an epic scale.
James DeWolf Perry is referring to one of his great-grandfathers, buried here in Bristol, Rhode Island. Katrina Brown, his cousin, is a direct descendant of the DeWolf family, too.
James DeWolf and his extended family brought more than 12,000 enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage and are probably responsible for about 500,000 people who are alive today in the Americas descended from those who crossed the Middle Passage on their ships.
The Middle Passage refers to the sea journey of ships from West Africa to the West Indies.
So one of the great ironies of Rhode Island is the fact that we are founded under religious freedom, but we soon enter and dominate the enslavement of human beings in the African slave trade.
And even churches were involved.
The church, particularly in Rhode Island, profited directly from the slave trade. But in a more direct way, we owned slaves. We had clergy who owned slaves. We had slaves that were owned by the missionary organizations that were creating the Anglican churches here in the United States.
And what's exciting about this list is that it's something...
Newport historian Keith Stokes says Rhode Island merchants paid for ships to bring more than 100,000 slaves to the New World.
Between 1705 and 1805, there are at least 900 documented slave ships that begin in Rhode Island and eventually end from West Africa through the West Indies and back to Rhode Island.
It was called the Triangle Trade.
They had rum distilleries in Bristol. They would take rum primarily, as well as other commodities, to the coast of West Africa to trade for men, women, and children, who were then brought back to be sold at auction, either in the Caribbean, and primarily that was in Cuba, or in the American South, in ports like Charleston, South Carolina.
The slave trade became a backbone of the American economy.
All of this was tremendously important in building the economy of the North and what became the United States. In the colonial era, the slave trade and the provisioning trade to slave plantations in the West Indies were a key part of what allowed the British colonies to prosper and eventually to rebel against Great Britain and become an independent nation.
At the time of his death in 1837, James DeWolf was the second richest man in America. After Rhode Island outlawed shipping slaves to North America in 1787, his nephew continued the slave trade illegally.
George DeWolf was actively involved in the illegal slave trade after 1808. They appear to have stopped being involved by 1820, when Congress increased the penalty and imposed the death penalty for those who engaged in the slave trade.
For the southern plantations, the African slaves brought skills useful in growing rice, tobacco, and cotton. cotton that fueled northern textile mills, including in Rhode Island. James DeWolf heavily invested in the textile mills that turned the cotton into garments, fueling America's Industrial Revolution. At the onset of the Civil War in 1861, there were 4 million enslaved Africans in the United States, a legacy the DeWolf family is trying to reconcile.
It's incumbent upon me as someone with this kind of a family history and knowing about this history to speak out about what our family did and to help other people draw the connections to the ways in which their families are connected to slavery. If we bury the dark parts of a family history, if we bury the dark parts of a national history, we will start to assume things like that didn't happen, and that will greatly distort our understanding of how we got here today.
At the Bristol Cemetery, Katrina finds the grave of one of 2 family slaves owned by James DeWolf.
So it's this horrible story of this image of 2 children being given as a Christmas present to one's wife. And she was called Adjoa.
Just being here makes me hope that she can hear us, and that honor and recognition of their lives is something that can pass through the spirits.
Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Bristol, Rhode Island.
Well, be sure to join Africa 54 on Friday when Chris Simpkins takes us to the place where history was made and reveals how the first African slaves shaped the course of a nation. Now, the head of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, says the U.S.-China trade war and uncertainty over Brexit pose risks to Africa's economic prospects. Serena Chowdhury explains.
The risks to Africa's economic prospects are increasing by the day, the head of the African Development Bank has warned, thanks to the US-China trade war and uncertainty around Britain's departure from the European Union. The impact of the trade dispute between the world's 2 largest economies, coupled with the threat of a no-deal Brexit, is worrying for growth across the African continent, Akinwumi Adesina said, adding that the bank could review its economic projection for Africa, currently at 4% in 2019 and 4.1% in 2020.
The industrial capacity has fallen significantly. And so the demand, even for products and raw materials for Africa, will only fall even further. So the effect of that will have a ripple effect on African economies as the demand for their products weaken from China.
To offset the impact of external shocks, the bank chief said African countries needed to boost trade with each other.
The challenge cannot be solved unless all the barriers come down. Free mobility of labor, free mobility of capital, and free mobility of people. This is very, very important for the continental free trade area.
A continental free trade zone was launched last month, bringing hopes of speeding up economic growth and development across Africa. But to boost trade, nations will still need to remove non-tariff barriers.
Well, Serena Chowdhury of Reuters with that report. Now, debt remains high in Zambia, and there is an ongoing tax dispute with the mining industry, and the political opposition complains of rough treatment by the government. What should the Southern African nation do to overcome its economic and political challenges? For insight, I am joined by Xavier Chisimba, a Zambian politician and former member of parliament. Xavier, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you.
Now, if we may begin with the economy of Zambia, what's going on? There's been a lot of talk about the so-called Smart Zambia initiative. To what extent do you see the government implementing those policies in order to help the economy grow?
Yeah, firstly, in the face of corruption, it becomes very difficult for the regime to implement the e-government, or Smart Zambia, if you like. There is a department at the cabinet level which has been set up. It's called the Smart Center Zambia. And of course, with ICTs in place, if you have the right technology, it's possible, for instance, to track taxation in the country. But whereas there's critical need to implement ICTs in sectors like taxation, revenue collection, authorities are not in a hurry to do that, because they do know that once transparency and accountability is entrenched, there will be a problem. Corruption would be scaled down.
Yeah.
China has taken over virtually every aspect of the economy. The debt burden has increased, and in fact, whereas the stakeholders do project that the debt burden is around 63% of Zambia's GDP. That's not true. The debt, external debt, especially Chinese debt, is far more than our country's GDP.
Now, one of the reasons why things are happening the way they're happening in Africa is that you get the sense that there are no institutions that are holding the governments accountable, that the leaders do whatever they want. So you're a member of the opposition. You actually have ambitions of becoming like president. What can you do? What should you do to ensure that institutions are set up in such a way that they serve the interests of the citizens and not the leaders?
Yes. To start with, Zambia needs reforms at the level of the constitution. For over 50 years, we've been talking about the constitution. Every president who comes into power changes the constitution. We have a situation, for instance, where the current president decided to wink actually his way into getting the Concord, that's the constitutional court, to give him another term when he should not run for another term. So effectively, you have a president who is seeking a third term. As if that is not enough, he has gone ahead to seek further amendments to give himself more power. Now I want to say that Africa needs strong institutions of governance rather than strong men and women.
Yeah, but for those institutions to be in place, there has to be a kind of a push from the interested parties, including the opposition, way before the elections. What happens is we see people in the opposition getting into government and realizing power is so sweet that they actually want to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, that propensity, the tendency of realizing that the power is sweet, it's not that they do realize when they get there. We have a problem. We've seen the recycling of the same people who are part of creating the problems that we have today. For instance, if you look at the current regime and some of the lead parties in opposition, you will find that the same people that brought China on board, they're the same ones who are in the current government. I did warn in 2009, when I quit as a member of parliament from the current ruling party, by then it was in the opposition, that China is going to lead our country siege, and that the culture of allowing the same people who were ministers in the previous government, the MMD, would see a continuation of the same policies, and that China would be so entrenched in our country that the local people, the local enterprises, they will not have no space in doing business. And this has come to pass.
Wow.
We have infrastructure development projects going on, and in the name of infrastructure, the country is getting more and more highly entitled.
I wish we had more time, but we do appreciate your perspective, Mr. Chisimba. We hope we bring you back next time again. Well, that's Mr. Xavier Chisimba, who is a Zambian politician and a former member of parliament in that country. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump says he wants Russia back at the table for the Group of 7 summit, even though it still controls Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula. Moscow was booted from the group over its unilateral 2014 annexation of the peninsula. As the G7 leaders head to France for their annual meeting this weekend, President Trump says it would make sense for Russian President Vladimir Putin to be part of the group again. President Trump seems unconcerned that Russia considers Crimea part of its territory, instead blaming former President Barack Obama for Russia's takeover of Crimea. The G7 includes Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. It's not clear whether any of the other countries support Russia rejoining the G7 to again make it the G8. The 3-day summit starts on Saturday. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming or broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, Ethiopian young people compete to develop tech solutions that address community challenges.
The lyrics could be French,
English,
Portuguese,
Bantu,
Arabic.
It is the beat.
The African beat that counts.
The beat does all the translations.
It cuts across all languages and gives us the understanding that this is the African beat.
It is so distinct
and adhesive.
It binds us together.
African Beat on the Voice of America. For more information, visit our website at www.voanews.com/AfricanBeat.
I am Sheikha Sali, host and senior editor of VOA's international call-in talk show, Straight Talk Africa.
Today we'll examine the tobacco industry.
We pretty much touch on anything that you can think of. Politics, health issues, human rights issues, you name it, we talk about it. The issues that we discuss are pertinent to most people on the African continent. A very, very rare and unique opportunity to interact with their leaders.
I'm Clara Frank, and here's what's trending. The Gamescom fair is underway in Cologne, Germany, and it's attracting thousands of gamers and cosplayers. There are an estimated 2.6 billion e-gamers worldwide who will spend some $148 billion on games and related products this year, according to research from Newzoo. That figure is forecast to rise to $174 billion by 2021 as e-gaming gains in popularity thanks to faster mobile connectivity and the spread of technologies like artificial intelligence and virtual reality. That makes online gaming and following esports pros on social networks such as Amazon's streaming platform Twitch a lucrative channel for advertisers and marketers as mainstays like TV stagnate. Next up, robo-shorts that assist the wearer's ability to both walk and run have been developed for the first time by engineers at Harvard's Weiss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. The lightweight, portable exosuit could help the elderly or infirm to walk or boost the performance of athletes. The device detects the wearer's gait and adjusts itself accordingly to make walking and running more energy efficient. The robo-shorts weigh 5 kilograms, and over 90% of the weight is close to the body's center of mass. And finally, the highlight of this year's international festival, Faces of the Streets event in Yekaterinburg, is the array of items made from cardboard, from simple crowns and cardboard hats to whole costumes, trees, and fairy tale animals. Cardboardia Country, a street art project involving professional actors, is behind this year's initiative. So why cardboard? You can get it everywhere. It's cheap, easy to work with, and accessible to anyone. It's also environmentally friendly. And that's what's trending today.
Well, a group of men and boys in South Sudan is trying to break cultural taboos on a topic that often drives young girls out of school: menstruation. The Men for Women group distributes menstrual pads to girls and encourages boys and men to advocate policies that make sanitary hygiene products more accessible. Sheila Pony reports from Juba.
Sunday Josephine grew up in a poor family of 12 in South Sudan's capital, Juba. When she reached puberty, her family couldn't afford sanitary pads.
Whenever my period came, I would use pieces of cloth or sometimes toilet paper to help.
At school, Sunday was teased and the shame was too much. She dropped out, became pregnant and never went back. Today, Sunday cleans offices to provide her child. South Sudan's all-male activist group, Men for Women, wants to prevent the same fate for other girls.
Boys are the ones that do a lot of period stigma to girls. When they see stains on the girl, they laugh at the girl. Why we are involving them is that we are trying to tell them that, look, this is a natural thing.
Men for Women works to remove that stigma by teaching menstrual health and hygiene in schools. At the Happy Angel Primary School, The group handed out sanitary pads and demonstrated how to use them.
At first, I'm fearing because there were questions and I don't know even how to answer them. But at the end, at the last, I feel good and I'm very grateful.
Men for Women is helping girls who don't have sanitary pads avoid being isolated and cut off from the community.
Oh, I'm actually impressed because it's the first time, I think, in the country for men to talk about menstruation.
They are also educating South Sudanese boys.
Today I feel so proud because it is good to teach most of the boys so that to encourage the girls. And I'm so happy.
Akumu says it is time to break the silence on menstruation, and Men for Women is a good step forward. Sheila Poni for VOA News, Juba.
About 100 young Ethiopians recently participated in a joint U.S.-Japanese sponsored competition to develop technology-based solutions that address community challenges. This year's Solve It Innovation Competition brought together 112 young tech entrepreneurs from 15 cities across Ethiopia. Eba Tesfaye has more from Addis Ababa.
22-year-old Gurmesa Gobana grew up watching neighbors struggling to farm using traditional methods. So using a bicycle as a base, he invented a device to do all the work farmers normally do by hand or by using oxen.
I started using this invention to practically help my community. And then I heard about this competition, which will give me the opportunity to meet with different organizations and people who could fund my invention. Then we can take it to every farmer to solve their challenges.
Gobena is one of over 100 Ethiopians who showcased their inventions in the second annual Solve It competition. The joint Japan-US sponsored contest challenges Ethiopian youth to come up with technology-based solutions to community problems.
Everyone wants to change the world. Everyone has, good solutions. Firstly, the core value for the users. What does the user want, and how does they solve the problem? This is a very, very important point.
23-year-old Daraftu Daraje wanted to reduce a major cause of maternal mortality in Ethiopia, bleeding to death after giving birth. So, her all-female team of biomedical engineers built a device for diagnosing and managing postnatal hemorrhages.
If hemorrhaging is treated well through accurate treatment based on accurate information rather than guesswork, we will save many lives. My mother had faced this problem when she was giving birth to me, and so I wanted to change that with the field I studied.
U.S. Ambassador Michael Rayner said nothing would make Ethiopia's ongoing political and economic reforms succeed like people's support and innovation. The Japanese and U.S. ambassadors awarded the top 3 inventors with cash prizes, with a first prize equal to $3,400. Eba Tesfaye for VOA News, Addis Ababa.
As young Africans energetically take on innovation, what should they know about intellectual property? To answer that question, joining me now is Andrea Evans, an intellectual property attorney. Ms. Evans, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so there's a lot of vibrance on the continent today. Young men and women are creating things, are building things. So what are the basics they need to know, especially? What is intellectual property or patent?
Well, intellectual property is divided into 3 parts: patents, trademarks, and copyrights. And simply put, you would patent an invention, trademark the name of that invention, and copyright any written materials.
Mm-hmm. And so what does that mean? What should that mean to the person?
Well, what that means is that the laws have afforded you the opportunity to protect your intellectual property so that if someone else tries to infringe on that intellectual property or use it without your permission, you can enforce your rights. Mm-hmm. The beauty of intellectual property is whatever you can do with real property, you can do with intellectual property. So you can license it, you can assign it, you can sell it, you can will it, so it can be extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm. Now, and I see you've written some books here to kind of serve as guidelines, but I noticed somewhere it says also that for someone to claim especially the rights, kind of in a more can I say, a stronger way. They need to sue if somebody takes their invention and uses it as their own. Now, how would the person know? How would the person know when it's the right time to do so?
Well, that's a good question. So the first thing is make sure you're taking the necessary steps to actually protect it. And then it's up to you to then police and enforce it. So law firms like myself can help you to monitor that. And let's step back. For inventions, for example, in the U.S., we look at the claims of the patent. So we're going to compare those claims to your actual product that you think is infringing. And then if it's infringing, we take the steps to enforce it. But you don't want to sit back and watch someone take advantage of your intellectual property.
There's also the idea that there are rules in different countries. They're not uniform. What do we know about that? That it could be different here than it is in South Africa, for example.
That's right. Each country has their own rules. So the first thing is there's no such thing as an international patent, trademark, or copyright. But the U.S. has different treaties in place with countries such as South Africa, where you can file an application, for example, here in the U.S. and then claim rights to the filing date in South Africa, for example, let's say for your invention, or let's say for your copyright. So if someone is taking notes today and jotting down notes or writing things or drawing in South Africa right now, if we want to protect the copyright, it's always best that before you publish, you take the necessary steps to ensure that you file in different countries, because your publication date can jeopardize your rights.
And this is important to say, because some of the younger people out there who are very enthusiastic about innovating and creating things may not even be thinking about this, may not be thinking about protecting. They may share the ideas with people, might, kind of take them and use them as their own.
Yes, and they share it, and people assume that because they give them credit that they are able to do so, but that's not the case. So the best thing to do is when you have a good idea, you step back and research and determine if you have something that's patentable. When you create a business, you want to do research now to ensure that it's available here and even in South Africa if you intend to do business there. And then with copyrights, as soon as you write down things and you put that pen to paper, you want to take the necessary steps to contact an attorney and copyright your written works.
Okay. Now I know. I'm not going to be sharing my brilliant ideas with everybody until I see you first.
That's right. Come see me.
Great. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that, Ms. Evans. And so Andrea Evans is an intellectual property attorney. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a good evening.